If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
At Floor & Decor, job lot quantities are no joke. We mean business with our large in-stock selection. With our flooring, tools, and installation materials, you can rely on us to supply large projects with the quantities you need. Shop large amounts for any job from our in-stock tile, wood, stone, luxury vinyl plank, and more. Visit your local Floor & Decor in Southwest San Antonio or online at flooranddecor.com. A lot of people tolerate ordinary. Ordinary bathrooms, kitchens, entryways. Well, not on your watch. If you're a pro, you've got a new partner in town, Floor & Decor. From tile to wood to stone, Floor & Decor has more styles and job lot quantities of Schluter, Mapei, Laticrete, and other brands pros trust. Come see a whole new way to wow with Floor & Decor. Now open in Southwest San Antonio.
Have you heard all the stories on the news lately about cold cases being solved by forensic genealogy? Are you fascinated by unsolved mysteries that you wish could be answered? Are you intrigued by DNA technology and its application to cold murder cases? Or do you just love a good story with a satisfying ending? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then I have the podcast for you. DNA ID is the only true crime podcast dedicated exclusively to cold cases solved by forensic genealogy. On my show, you'll get all the behind-the-scenes details on how these cases were brought to closure and how the victims finally got justice. Listen to DNA ID Season 3 starting January 16th, 2023, wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Scene of the Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is Zodiac Speaking.
Hey everyone, welcome back to a new episode of Zodiac Speaking. This is going to be a different episode than you're used to hearing. I'm flying solo. This is Mike Morford by myself. No Rich. We are here to talk about something that people have been asking me about and I've been putting off for a while, and finally said, you know what, let me take a little bit of time here and get this done. It's an episode about my suspect, William Mac Andrew, who I simply call Mac. Why I came to suspect him, what I think of the clues, and where things stand now, all this time later. So it should be interesting. Towards the end of this episode, you're going to hear from two experts who sort of help me, fill in some of the blanks as far as Mac as a suspect and where they see, with their expertise, where they see Mac fitting in possibly. And one of the experts is Dr. Mellor, who's a criminologist who studies the minds of serial killers and has written several books. He came up with a profile of his Zodiac suspect, not any suspect in particular, just who he thinks Zodiac was, based on his expertise and his knowledge and his history of researching these kinds of killers. And he gives a blind profile that I later compared to my suspect, and we sort of fill in the blanks and say, well, what matches, what doesn't? Does any of Mac's stuff fit in with his profile? And it was done independently of me, nothing to do with me. He did his own profile, before I even went public with Mac. So he'll be on to discuss that. And then also we have a Geoprofiler, which is Douglas MacGregor. And he's done some extensive work on profiling cases, and in particular, he has a profile on the Zodiac case where he thinks Zodiac lived, and he sort of goes through the things of where is things fall short when it comes to profiling, geoprofiling, what things can be learned from geoprofiling. It's a tool that police do use frequently to help establish patterns and see where offenders may reside, that kind of thing. So we will talk to Doug and see what he thinks, based on his geoprofile, how that fits Mac. So without further ado, let's just jump right in here. Again, this is going to be live recording, no editing, rough. So a little bit different than you're used to hearing on the show, but it's sort of a little bit different process when it's just myself here, not with Rich, and we're not going through a single case or a single episode with a script and going through point by point. So the main thing I'm going to read from here is on Tom Voigt's ZodiacKiller.com. There's a thread called MacGregor, MacGruber, and then it says real name William McDuff Andrew. That is the thread on Tom's site that you can go through, and on page 1, the very first post is pinned, is sort of an outline of the entire case against Mac. And I'll sort of run through that checklist for this episode. I'm not going to get into all kinds of different things. I'm just going to go down that checklist basically. But, just a quick background. For some reason, somehow, the Mac thread just really exploded. And it resulted in the most popular, most posted in thread on ZodiacKiller.com's history. And I think, last time I checked anyway, it had, somewhere in the neighborhood of 27,000 posts. So by far it was the most popular topic ever on that website. Not all of it was good. Not all of it was positive. There's a lot of trolling and a lot of infighting and a lot of, people just pushing back on Mac as a suspect. And I'm open to criticism. I'm open to debate. I don't like trolling just for the sake of trolling. Sometimes other people who have no interest in this suspect, but because the suspect thread that they're interested in discussing is totally dead, they come to this thread and sort of push back on him just for the sake of having some conversation and, sort of poo-pooing the suspect. As far as, real criticism and things that don't add up, I think that's fair game. But trolling for the sake of trolling, I'm not a fan of, and there's a lot of that in this thread. So you'll have to read through a lot of crappy posts to get through the bulk of the 27,000 posts. But there's a lot of good stuff there too, and a lot of good ideas and legitimate questions and legitimate criticisms. But definitely worth a look. So again, starting with post number 1 in the thread called MacGruber, real name William McDuff Andrew, is where I'm going to read from for this timeline. So just a little bit of a background on how I came to look at this suspect and find the suspect. For a long time, I was convinced, I had this very, very strong opinion that the Zodiac was someone who resided in Riverside, California, and was connected to the Sherry Jo Bates. Even if he didn't kill her in 1967, I was convinced that he started out writing letters to her, to the police and newspapers there in Riverside about that case. And then I thought they later moved on to move to the Vallejo area and then started writing letters there as the Zodiac. And this was mainly based on the MO, the wording, the writing. It was just so similar and such a similar pattern that I said, this has to be connected. This has to be Zodiac, most likely. And I had spent a lot of time looking at Ross Sullivan, who was an interesting suspect for a number of reasons. He was the closest I'd ever seen to the infamous SFPD sketch of Zodiac, and he had that Riverside connection in the library where Sherry Jo Bates was murdered. But I always stopped short of saying, yes, Ross Sullivan was the Zodiac, because, there were some physical differences. He was, 6'2". But again, I'm open to the height being a little bit off, so that wasn't a big deal breaker. But the biggest deal breaker for me was that he could not be placed in Vallejo or San Francisco. There were some rumors he was in San Francisco, but no confirmation. There was never any connection to him for Vallejo. There was some doubt as to whether he could drive. He was suffering from mental illness, and in 1968 was arrested for pinning somebody in a phone booth in Santa Cruz. So for all of that, as interesting as Ross was as a suspect, I could just never say he was the Zodiac with, and say that with emphasis and feel like I was right about it. So I always held back on saying that. And then I started thinking, I talked to a police officer, a retired detective friend of mine, and, we started going through the case, and he said, if I was working this case with you, what I would suggest is we discount the Riverside, case. We don't know if that was Zodiac. We know that Lake Herman Road and everything after that in Vallejo and San Francisco and Napa, we know that's Zodiac. So, he recommended I focus on the known canonical Zodiac crimes and not go down the endless speculation and theories that Riverside may be connected. So I said, okay, let me take a fresh start. Let me forget Riverside exists at all. And first let me see how could this not be Zodiac and Riverside? And I said that writing, what Zodiac wrote in his materials after 1969, and what the writer in Riverside wrote back in 1967, 1966 was so much alike that I thought that it had to be him. But then, Rich and I did an episode back in I forget which episode it was now, but we discussed a very specific magazine article, one of those dime store detective magazines, those pulp magazines that was very popular. And in it discussed the Sherry Jo Bates case, and it spelled out word for word, even with the misspellings, what the author in the Bates case wrote, the words that they chose. So, and that was published in a magazine prior to Zodiac using those same words and phrases in 1969 and after. So it dawned on me that this may be, a case of Zodiac reading about this case in that magazine, and then using some of the words and phrases for himself. And I knew that all of a sudden, hey, this maybe he never was in Riverside, so this might be a red herring I've been chasing in Riverside. But then, we had the issue of the writing. Obviously Sherwood Morrill thought that this writing in Riverside was also Zodiac. So I was like, well, how do I get around that? Well, lo and behold, one of the Bates case letters, the author was exposed as being a teenage kid that was doing a prank. And, he didn't, the killer apparently didn't send those letters in Riverside. At least, the Bates had to die letters. So that sort of left a hole of, okay, maybe Sherwood Morrill was wrong about this writing in Riverside. Maybe there, besides the similarities in the language and the writing, there was, no concrete physical evidence that Zodiac was in Riverside. So that made me feel a little bit better about going away from Riverside and looking elsewhere and looking in Vallejo, which is where we know the Zodiac was in 1968. So what I did was I said, okay, I want to examine everybody I can find in Vallejo who could potentially be a suspect. And I originally had an idea that, one thing that jumped out to me was at Blue Rock Springs, the killer of Darlene Ferrin left for a couple minutes and then returned a little bit later and then started shooting on that second time he came back. My thinking was perhaps that he had drove home real quick to get a gun and then came back, and then that could explain the few minutes. So I started looking at homes in that area, saying, well, if he came back in 5-10 minutes, something like that, where could he have lived at in that proximity to where he could have gone home, got a gun, came back, and started shooting? And I found out that there were very few homes within that driving distance. So I started thinking that theory was probably not going to be good, because back then it just wasn't developed. There wasn't a lot of homes there. So I sort of went to a backup theory, and that was, the phone call after Blue Rock Springs, that phone booth. That was where the call came from, that Nancy Silver took from Zodiac. I started thinking there's something off there, because that was a few mile drive from the crime scene, yet the call came 40 minutes later. So it should not have taken that long to drive to that phone booth. And if you're the killer that just shot 2 people and thought you murdered 2 people, are you really going to hang around and drive around town aimlessly, at 1 o'clock in the morning after midnight, and then just choose this phone booth randomly? Or wouldn't you get out of town and make your escape, and then maybe call from San Francisco or some town on your way out, So here's this call coming 40 minutes later when it should have come 10 minutes later if Zodiac drove straight there. So I had this missing 30 minutes, and I started thinking, well, what could you do in that 30 minutes if you were Zodiac? I started thinking, well, you may not want to drive that car just in case somebody saw him. So, he might want to drive home and stash that car, change out of his clothes because there could have been blood spatter. Obviously hide the gun. You don't want to be caught, after midnight, you're driving around, you get pulled over and there's a gun. All of a sudden you're connected to this murder that just happened. So I started thinking he may want to get rid of all that stuff, clean himself, take a shower, change his clothes, hide his gun, park his car. But then that left me with the possibility of, okay, so is he walking back to that phone booth? And if he's walking back to that phone booth, he's got to live pretty close to it. And this phone booth was on the intersection of Springs and Tuolumne. And I started thinking, okay, so what if this guy lives close by? And knowing Zodiac, he probably got his kicks out of watching the police respond to this phone booth when they inevitably traced the phone call. So I started thinking this guy could live right there. And, it's pretty well established that a lot of killers start out close to home, a lot of serial offenders, and then they work their way further and further out. So I always felt that Zodiac was in Vallejo and probably close to this phone booth. So I set about trying to do, geoprofiling everybody I could, data collecting, data mining everyone there I could in that phone book in 1969. Looking specifically in that area for anyone that was in, say, a short walking distance, maybe less than a quarter mile, who could be out there that could walk to this phone booth, make that call, and return to the cover of home without being spotted, without being stopped. Well, the first thing I noticed was going through that phone book, and you can go house by house, address by address, and determine who lives in that home. And then you can narrow it down if you want to put enough work like I did, like I spent endless hours doing this. You can determine the homeowner, their family members, and then you can narrow it down to, okay, who was white, who was a male, who was between the ages of 20 and 50. You can really start to whittle that list down to which is what I did. I went, a quarter mile in every direction of that phone booth, essentially, and pinpointed every home and determined who was in each home. And I'd say I had a really good success rate, maybe 90% or so, and was able to determine who was in every house. And again, knowing that Zodiac was white, he was a male. He was sometime, age is open to debate, but between 20 and 50, I was able to put a list together, a very short list. And in that area, most of the locations right around that phone booth were businesses that no one lived in. They're strictly businesses. But it just so happened that the suspect, Mac Andrew, lived in his family's business in an apartment in the back of it. And it was 387 feet from that phone booth. So when I identified him, I said, okay, he's just another person on this list. And the list was very short by now because, again, I've narrowed it down to only white males between the ages of 20 and 50. So I could count on one hand almost the amount of people there were. And then I obviously looked to see if anyone had criminal records and that kind of thing. So I found a picture of William Andrew. He was born on February 14th, 1945. So he was 24 years old in 1969. When I found this picture, it was in the 1963 yearbook for his high school that he attended in Vallejo. And the first thought was, okay, here's this heavy-set kid with glasses and a crew cut. Zodiac-esque. But then again, there were a lot of people that were, had that general look because you were back then you were a hippie or you were this, square that, someone that's straight and narrow and conservative, and they'd have that look. And then with the glasses, it fit like a million people. I wasn't really excited by the fact that he looked a little bit like the Zodiac. I'd seen a lot of people that fit that description. So, the next thing I said is, okay, I've got to, see if there's anything else. I put him up a little notch because he did look like him and he was heavy set. I said, well, let me look into him a little bit more. And I was able to find out that he had gotten a ticket, and the ticket listed his height and weight of 5'8" and, 200 pounds. And that was the description of Zodiac pretty much is in that range. Most of the people that saw Zodiac estimated him to be that range. Now Mac was a little bit younger than most estimates, but let's not forget, a lot of people, for whatever reason on this message board, wanted to rule out Mike Morford and just say he's not a reliable witness. You can't use anything he said. But, Mike did say that his attacker was 26 to 30 years old, 200 pounds, chubby, with a large round face. And that described Mac Andrew, William Andrew. So, I said, let me set out to get this guy's handwriting. And I obtained a copy of his Social Security application. And I said, I'm hoping when I get it, his handwriting is just going to look nothing like Zodiac's. And then I'll just be able to move him way down the list. But the opposite was true. When I got the writing, I said, oh my God, this writing is very close. It's got the crazy slant like Zodiac has. Some of the letters jumped right out. The W's, and I'm not looking at it right now as I'm speaking, but I'm going by memory. And I said, wow. I said, here's that crazy slant writing, and I see letters that are popping out. And, right away I said, I can't rule him out. Now I've got to go the opposite direction. He looks, pretty interesting now because all of a sudden he's close to that phone booth, 387 feet away. He's got writing that looks a lot like Zodiac's, and he fits the physical description. So, instead of ruling him out, I was going the opposite direction now. So I enlisted the help of a couple people to help me do some research, and that's when things got really interesting because I was able to put a timeline together of this guy's life, and basically it mirrors Zodiac's timeline very closely. And what I mean by that is there were a lot of major life events in William Andrew's life that line up with stops and starts in Zodiac's patterns. And that was something, I learned after talking to some of the detectives on the Golden State Killer case. They felt that stops and starts in the Golden State Killer's activity would be tied to things that happened in his life. The births of children, marriages, new jobs, those kinds of things. And sure enough, when they caught the Golden State Killer, it turns out that, he had a murder in 1981, and he didn't kill anyone again until 1986 when he killed his last victim. And in that case, the 1981 and 1986 murders coincide with the births of his two daughters. So that is a real thing, that there are major life events that are called triggers that cause someone that's a killer, that's a serial predator, to act on those things. And that act could be anything as, from writing a letter to committing a crime. But what I found with William Andrew is that in the spring of 1971, he took a job with the state. And that is the time that Zodiac stopped writing. Zodiac didn't write another letter until 1974. Well, what happened to Mac in 1974? He met his future wife, got engaged, and was married that year, all around the time that the Zodiac started writing again. And Mac got married in the fall of 1974, and there was never another confirmed letter. We'll say confirmed for now. Never another confirmed letter from Zodiac after that. So I can tie Mac's job, career, meeting his wife, getting married, all of that ties in perfectly to Zodiac's stops and starts in his letter writing campaign from 1971 to 1974. So this isn't a case of me trying to shove a square, peg in a round hole. That stuff just fits. And all of that was just compelling. It was just one thing after another that was suddenly interesting. But then again, we found out one of the most interesting things, that, Mac had a dying relative, a cousin, in Deer Lodge, Montana, which is what is believed to have been mentioned, that town, by Zodiac at Lake Berryessa, which is huge because it wasn't in any of the California newspapers at the time. There would be no way of Zodiac using that name, just grasping it because he saw it in a news report or something, and using it at Lake Berryessa for some kind of bullshit story to calm Brian and Cecilia down. So I think he knew about that in some way, knew about that town, and the fact that his Mac had a relative that was dying in that town at that exact moment was just huge. But the real interesting thing came when someone pointed out to me that on Mac's website and his wife's website that they used to run together, after Mac's death in 2014, she made a post about a book that she found in his belongings called The Codebreakers. This was a book that many people think Zodiac used to decipher, create ciphers. And she wrote on this that this was the second copy that he had. She said that he had another one previously, but he liked it so much that when he lost that one, he wanted the book again. So obviously this book meant something to him. And the fact he didn't want to get rid of it when his wife had asked him to, it had some kind of value. So now we had somebody living 387 feet from the phone booth that had an interest in ciphers and codes, that had writing that looked much like Zodiac's, who fit the physical description overall of Zodiac. And when I threw all that together, I said, in my mind, there's no way this isn't the Zodiac. And I said publicly, I believe 100% this is the Zodiac. And from there, I'm still on record as saying that I'm convinced that this is Zodiac. I since turned all this stuff into SFPD, and I've had some interaction with them. I don't want to go into detail about what it was. But essentially now we're just in a waiting game. And the waiting game is, there was some interesting stuff that came from our interaction, but I think the waiting game is that they want to, rather than chase down every lead on every suspect that somebody sends them, I think they just want to solve this case using genetic genealogy to pinpoint who the person is rather than chase 1,000 different suspects. They'd rather just have the genealogy tell them who Zodiac was and pinpoint him instead of chasing down a bunch of different suspects. That's my take anyhow. But again, here we are a year later, and the case is officially not solved, despite all these claims by the code breakers and other people that have said the case is solved. It's not. It's officially unsolved, but I still believe with 100% certainty when this case is solved, if it's solved, hopefully it's solved, that the name said by police as the Zodiac will be William McDuff Andrew. And I'm sticking to that. Now, again, I'm human. I could be wrong, but I'm convinced 100% that I'm not. And in time will hopefully, tell. So I set about trying to get writing of his, get more stuff, fill in some blanks, anything I could to fill in the background about Mac's life, and especially the timeline around the Zodiac crimes. And what I found was that, from 1968 to 1971 is mostly blank, which is when Zodiac was most active. In 1968, Mac attended college at Chico State in June 1968. And he had some roommates at a house there off campus. And, I was able to track down 3 or 4 of those roommates. And they all, again, none of them, I asked them pointed questions. I didn't say, do you think your roommate was the Zodiac? I sort of held that back until the very end. Not one of them said, I think Mac was dangerous, violent, that kind of thing. Nobody pointed that out. Nobody pointed out Mac, singing the Mikado or anything like that. I don't want to paint a picture like that. But I did get from all of them that Mac was a bit odd, that he did not have success dating at all, where most of them had fiancés, were getting married, were starting their life. He wasn't. He was alone. And in 1968, when college ended for them, and they all went on to careers and marriages and things like that, Mac was left to himself. And one of his roommates made it a point to say, that he always felt guilty, sort of leaving Mac to fend for himself. And felt guilty over that and didn't really know what he did. They all sort of lost track of him. Now, over the years, they would pop up at these random weddings and they would get together for wedding parties, that kind of thing. But nobody really knew what was going on with Mac's day-to-day life, so it's been hard filling in the blanks. But so here we are all this time later. I'm still trying to get answers. I'm still trying to hear from people that knew him. And that's where we're at. But I'm going to go through this timeline that's posted again on Tom's site, and item for item here. So Mac grew up in Vallejo, living in an apartment connected to his father's real estate business from 387 feet away from Springs and Tuolumne. So that's a fact. In June 68, Mac graduated from Chico State College. Chico State, not really close to Vallejo. So I forget how many miles away. I almost said it was 200 miles away. Not around the corner, that's for sure. So later, Mac's wife, I had reached out to her respectfully. I didn't want to pressure her. I didn't want to call her, say to her directly, I think your husband was a serial killer. But I reached out to her and said I was doing some research on him, and I'd appreciate it if she contacted me. She chose not to contact me, which is her prerogative, her right. I just wanted her to reach out so I could open up a dialogue with her and talk to her. And I respected the fact she didn't, and I never contacted her again. Now, later on, it slipped out that I was looking at Mac and we were discussing him on this forum, and someone, just being a troll that they were, tweeted his wife that we were discussing Mac as Zodiac on the forum. So eventually she joined the forum, and she actually corresponded with us and answered questions and was pretty open, for the most part, I think, about Mac. And she answered some questions when she could and filled in some blanks. And one of the things she told us was that Mac went to college in 1968 in South Dakota. Well, following that lead, I tracked down Mac's yearbook photo in South Dakota in 1968, and that photo looked very much like Zodiac's description of heavy attacker. Mac was 5'8", again 200 pounds. He was chubby. He had a large face. That fit. And this was an interesting photo because the 1963 photo I had of Mac, he had a crew cut, sort of what we see in San Francisco at the Stein scene. At Lake Berryessa, the month before the Stein murder, Brian saw what he thought was greasy brown hair poking down through the eye slits in the mask. And this photo from 1968 of Mac had that kind of hair that you could see if his hair got messy, if it got sweaty, it would hang down and poke through a mask. So I've seen Mac sort of with the SFPD look of the crew cut and what he may have looked like, with sweaty hair that Brian Hartnell saw at Lake Berryessa, and he sort of fits both of those molds. Again, going back through the details, we don't know what happened at Lake Herman Road, but we do know what happened at Blue Rock Springs, and that's where Mike Morford described Zodiac as 5'8", 195 pounds, chubby with a large round face, 26 to 30 years old, no glasses. So at that time, Mac was 24 years old, 5'8", 200 pounds, chubby with a large round face, and he didn't always wear glasses. We've seen photos with and without glasses. So he fit Mike Morford's description. But again, for some reason, everybody that sort of tries to shut Mac down says you're not allowed to believe this witness. But they only want you to believe the SF witnesses because they place Zodiac as being older, so we have to listen to them. But Morford is shut down as a witness. He's discounted, which is just preposterous. You're supposed to, from an investigative standpoint, you take all of the accounts into consideration. You don't just pick and choose which witnesses you're going to discount and which ones you're not. So again, we have the early July 5th, 1969 phone call from the phone booth, 387 feet from Mac's house. And when the police responded there, he could have been watching them right through the window getting his kicks. And one thing that was always troublesome was that Zodiac in his letter mentioned the man that saw me was a black man. He saw me in my brown car. I always felt that Zodiac was trying to sell that. He's trying to sell the fact that he was there in a brown car, that somebody saw him. Why would he volunteer that? So I always thought he was definitely lying about that. And then, it fed right into my theory that he wasn't there in a car at all. He's trying to send police in a different direction. Thought he was there on foot, and that's because he had walked there from 387 feet away. Then we have September 21st, 1969, in Deer Lodge. Mac's cousin is in Deer Lodge being treated by a doctor. She's extremely ill. She's probably going to die. And then, on the 25th, she's examined again, and she's got something called bronchopneumonia in Deer Lodge. So you can sort of put two and two together and say, is it possible that Mac's parents talk to relatives in Deer Lodge and say, hey, so-and-so's not doing so well. She's not going to make it, blah, blah, blah. And in that conversation, do his parents talk to Mac about it and say, hey, you remember your cousin so-and-so? Well, she's dying in Deer Lodge. Well, on the 25th, his cousin in Deer Lodge takes a turn for the worse. On the 27th, 2 days later, Zodiac at Lake Berryessa, during conversation, mentions he's an escaped prisoner from Deer Lodge, Montana. So again, the timing, it's just hard to explain. October 13th, his cousin dies in Deer Lodge, Montana. So we have some things. Again, his wife, Mac's wife, tried to help fill in some blanks. She said that in 1970, she thought that he was living with his parents exclusively in Vallejo, and this would have been 387 feet from the phone booth. However, we see a 1970 address in Chico for Mac by himself. So again, if we have to assume that he was at least using an address there, and at least when the area was canvassed and someone filled out information to be put in the phone book, that earlier to that, he was at least using an address there, whether he was living there or not. But his wife, based on her recollection, thought he was living with his parents in Vallejo. But we also have to remember, she did not meet him until 1974. So anything that his wife has said is secondhand information. She was not there. She does not know firsthand. So in June 1970, Richard Raditich was gunned down in San Francisco near 643 Waller Street. A week later, Zodiac wrote a letter hinting that he killed Raditich. Well, in October 1971, and again, this is going by phone books, a Mac Andrew is listed in San Francisco at 551 Dubachi Avenue, 0.2 miles from the Raditich shooting. And there's only one Mac Andrew that I could find anywhere listed on Ancestry.com. And they were the one in Vallejo, which we know was Mac, the one in Chico, which we assume was Mac, and this one in San Francisco. Which again is important because if we can place him there in San Francisco, the letters were getting mailed on weekdays in San Francisco in the Zodiac case. And now he's very close to this Raditich shooting. So even if he didn't do the shooting, it could be on his mind to send a letter talking about it. So then we have March 1971. Zodiac mailed his last letter for almost 3 years. Spring of 1971, Mac takes a job with the state of California. We're not sure what position he had, but by the end of his 30-year career, he was a prison sergeant. And he also instructed guards on shooting. So he definitely has some gun knowledge. There's a little bit of a misprint here that in 1971, Mac's future wife moves with her family from another state to Vallejo. I don't remember if that's accurate. I know, whatever the case, she did not meet Mac until 1974. So just wanted to clarify that. By 1973, Mac was listed as living at his parents' new home in Vallejo, still within 500 feet of their previous home in that general area, but now they've moved. So January 1974, Zodiac writes his first letter in 3 years. This is around the time that Mac has now met his wife. They start dating. Mac is engaged by June of 1974. In July 1974, Zodiac mailed his last confirmed letter. October 1974, Mac gets married, and he moves to Vacaville. And he lives 300 feet from a couple who had received a letter in 1969 while they were living in Vallejo from someone claiming to be the Zodiac. And this is the infamous Oakland A's baseball tickets that were sent to this couple by someone claiming to be Zodiac. Coincidentally or not, he wound up living next to them 300 feet away in Vacaville when they moved to Vacaville. So pretty interesting. This one next piece of information is also interesting because, the 1978 letters from Zodiac, someone claiming to be Zodiac, are widely dismissed across the board as fakes from experts. But in more recent years, the December 1990 Eureka card has come into the public eye, and a lot of discussion on this, whether this could actually be the real Zodiac. This is important because Eureka is 200 miles from Vallejo. It's just nowhere close to the Zodiac action, so to speak. But Mac purchased property in the Eureka area in the 1980s. That's 200 miles from Zodiac's home base of Vallejo. Yet here we have a possible Zodiac letter, and here we have Mac popping up in that same town, 200 miles away. Again, this is just one of the things that sort of connects dots. It just keeps on popping up in this case. Mac died in 2014. And again, now it goes into the description of Zodiac's or Mac's guilt box, written on the side of David Kahn's Codebreaker's book. And Mac's widow mentioned that Mac had originally read the book in 1980, as far as she knows, and lost his original copy. And according to her, she liked the book so much, he asked her to get another copy. And one was found in the box. So he kept it. Now, again, just some odd pieces of information here that don't really fit in. Mac's friends recall him driving or having access to what two people called a Volvo or Volvo-like car in the late 60s. One of the friends thought it was tan. The other one thought it was brown. One of them thought it was tan or brown. The other one thought it was blue. Again, nothing conclusive there. And again, just recounting what his friends said. They said that they thought Mac was odd compared to most people, but they felt he was harmless. They said he did not date or have relationships when they knew him prior to the end of college. And most of them didn't socialize with him until after 1970. After college, they didn't associate with him. One of them found out he had become a prison guard, and they were shocked, and they felt that he was too timid to do that kind of job. And again, none of Mac's friends ever recalled him having any interest in the Mikado, the Most Dangerous Game, etc. But they did, his friends did say that he did read these true crime detective magazines. So the very same magazine that Zodiac could have gleaned that Sherry Jo Bates information out of in her case, Mac was a reader of those magazines. So again, it is what it is. Mac was heavily involved in Freemasonry in the 1960s and 1970s. So that's a lot of it in a nutshell. The crucial bits of information are the 387 feet proximity to the phone booth, his overall description fitting Zodiac's overall description. Again, Mike Morford stating that his attacker was 26 to 30 years old. In San Francisco, those witnesses said they thought Zodiac was 35 to 45 years old. Now, again, I also want to point out Mike Morford was shot from a couple feet away. Zodiac was right outside his car door, shooting into the car. He was seated down, and he had a light shining in. But important, he did see Zodiac before the light was in his eyes. So people seem to want to dismiss that. We also have to count the fact that the San Francisco witnesses saw Zodiac from 50 feet away at night while they were elevated in an upstairs room. So, if you're going to dismiss Mike Mageau's ability to accurately detail what he saw, then you've sort of got to be fair and do that with the other witnesses in San Francisco. But in reality, what you need to do is you need to consider what all of the witnesses are telling you. If one is saying, he was heavy, he was stocky, and then the other one's saying that, then there's a good chance that they're both right. If one's saying that they saw glasses and the other says they don't have glasses, we have to consider that as well. So I think you have to take all the things into consideration for all of these witnesses, and not just pick and choose which ones you're going to choose. But height-wise, weight-wise, physical description-wise, he fits the bill. Large, round face was something Mike Mageau was very specific about. And Mac has a large, round face. There's just no getting around that. We know Mac had an interest in ciphers and codes, which, people that tried to be dismissive of them, lots of people had interest in ciphers or codes. Well, as far as I know, on this message board, there weren't many suspects that had an interest in ciphers and codes that could be verified. Mac was one of those people that had such an interest in it that he had not one, but 2 copies of the same book. So, hard to dismiss that. And getting back to one thing about Mac's age, again, the witness descriptions, whether it's Mike Mageau, whether it's the SFPD kids, the age range is all over the place, from 26 to 30 to 35 to 45. But we also can't dismiss the fact that both Brian Hartnell and Officer Slade, who took the call from Zodiac after Lake Berryessa, said it sounded like the person they were talking to was in his 20s. So again, is a voice description as good as viewing someone in appearance wise? No. But at the same time, you can get a good sense if you're talking to someone, if they're younger or older, whatever. And both of these ear witnesses thought that the person they were talking to, Zodiac, was in his 20s. So there's nothing that physically rules Mac out in this instance. Some people try to say, well, he's got big ears that protrude. Well, in his 1963 photo, they do look like they protrude. And in his 1968 photo, they don't look like they protrude that much. So, and again, we're talking about the people that made that SFPD sketch. We're not looking from 2 to 3 feet away in daylight at the suspect. They were looking from the suspect at 50 feet away at night. So there's bound to be some little thing that's off. I love how these people say that, this is a perfect likeness, like Zodiac posed for this picture with perfect lighting, when in reality it was 50 feet away at night. So there's bound to be something that could be off. Could his ears be a little bit off? Absolutely. But overall, Mac has the physical traits, the physical appearance, the height, the weight, the build, the large round face. Just about everything fits. And then you have his handwriting looking very similar. You have his interest in codes. You have his proximity to the phone booth. You have his timeline lining up with Zodiac's stops and starts in activity. Again, not me trying to make it that way. It is what it is. It just happens to line up. It just happens to be that a possible Zodiac letter came from Eureka, California, 200 miles away from Vallejo. And it just so happens that Mac owned property there. Again, it is what it is. I'm not trying to just draw straws and point to things that may be clues. Those are facts. If I search a property record and find Mac purchased property there, and we also have a Eureka card possibly mailed from Zodiac, then those two are just facts. Could they be coincidences? Sure, but again, when you have all these other things that start to line up on top of each other, just stacked on top of each other, it's hard to ignore. And for all of that, that's why I still come to the conclusion that I'm convinced 100% Mac was the Zodiac. I'm hoping that the case is solved. I'm hoping that way. No matter if I'm right or wrong, I'm hoping the case is solved. But I predict if the case is solved that they're going to announce that Mac was the Zodiac. And until I see something that points away from that, I'm going to continue to believe it, because what I've seen so far, just there's nothing that rules him out. Everything just seems to rule him in. I've been hunting for writing, audio, video, more witnesses, anybody that knew Mac that could provide more information to help rule him out or potentially rule him in more. And I've been come up short. For her part, Mac's wife said that, and I don't recall the exact reason, something to do with a family dispute or something, but I believe she said that Mac's photos and audio, video, anything that she had of his primarily that might provide more in the way of hearing or seeing more of him, more of his writing, all that was lost in some kind of incident that happened. And I'll have to go back and find her post about that. But from her take, there's not much to be gleaned, more stuff that we can find on Mac that she knows of. I also want to point out that, I don't accuse his wife of having knowledge of Mac's activities. I don't think she's any kind of participant. I want to put that on record. I don't think she was helping cover it up. I think that if Mac was Zodiac, he wouldn't have told her that. And she did not meet him until 1974 when Zodiac's activity was ceased. So anything she knows about Mac's time before that, she would know secondhand. It would be information that she learned from other people or from Mac himself, and would have no firsthand knowledge of his life before she met him. So that's just a fact. That's the way it is. And I don't want anyone thinking that I'm accusing her of having knowledge of his crime, trying to cover it up, anything like that. I think she chose to talk and be open within reason, when she could have just said we were crazy and told me to go pound sand. She did open up some kind of communication, so I appreciate that from her. And I can't imagine being in her shoes, all of a sudden finding out somebody thinks that your spouse was a serial killer. But again, if somehow, some way, somebody comes forward with something that rules Mac out, I will be the first one to reach out to her and say, I apologize. I was wrong. If the case is solved and someone else is called Zodiac and the police say the case is closed and it was so-and-so and that name isn't William Mac Andrew, I will apologize and say, hey, I was wrong. I'm open to being wrong. I'm human. Some people are not open to being wrong. They'll just keep at something despite everything, ruling it out. And they're just so locked in on their favorite suspect that they won't even listen to reason. They won't listen to anything that rules them out. I'm not like that. If somebody officially rules Mac out or officially solves the case and police say it's solved, I'm going to respect that final outcome. I think it's going to be DNA that solves this case. Now, a little bit about the genealogy where Mac's concerned. If they can find out who Zodiac was using the DNA, it's going to be a little bit harder for connecting it to Mac. And the reason why his parents are dead, he's dead and he was cremated. So, finding his DNA directly is going to be tough. He had no siblings. He had no children. So it's not like you can go, some of these cases that are solving with DNA and genealogy, they go to a family member, close family member, and get their DNA and say, okay, we can't get the suspect's DNA, but we can get their sibling or their parent or their child. That can't happen in this case. So it's going to have to be a more distant relative. Now, Mac did have a lot of cousins in California, so it's not impossible that this can be tracked back to Mac. If he was a Zodiac, it's not a lost cause. And if genealogy is an option, it may point back to him still, despite him having no family members to test their DNA and him being cremated. So that's where things stand on the Mac front. It's something that I've sort of put on the back burner because I feel like I've gone as far as I can at this point. it's in the hands of the police. They have everything that I've laid out. They have more that I'm not going to get into. And it may prove to be valuable. If it'll be important if he turns out to be Zodiac, and if he doesn't, then it doesn't matter. So I'm sitting back, I'm being patient, I'm hoping that this case is solved with genealogy, and then we'll find out who Zodiac was. And if I'm wrong, there'll be a bunch of people in the forum laughing and saying you were wrong. But by the same token, if I'm right, I'll be on the forum, calling out some people that had some words for me. So time will tell. It's going to be interesting. I love, the fact that Mac is sort of undercover, under the radar. While there's 27,000 posts on Tom Voigt's site about Mac, Mac hasn't really got any national spotlight, which I sort of like. Whereas these other people, somebody writes a book about him, writes a magazine article about him, or comes out with a claim and makes a press release, the press just soaks that stuff up and just buys in hook, line, and sinker to these different suspects. And then here we are 6 months later, a year later, the case still isn't solved. And all of a sudden another one comes along and the press just keeps buying into it. They make documentaries, they make TV shows. We'll hear Mac flies under the radar, which is good, because if the case is solved, having something to be released after the case is solved, if it's solved and he's Zodiac, that'll be a little bit more rewarding to have everything that can be released all at once done in a controlled method, and I'll have a lot of that to share, hopefully. But again, at the end of the day, I just want to see the case solved, whether I'm right or wrong. The families of the victims deserve justice, and I just want to know. At the end of the day, I just want to know who Zodiac was. A lot of other people do too. I still think there will be people that will fight tooth and nail and say, no, there's no way this person wasn't Zodiac. It was my suspect, and that they just won't accept. Even if the police hold a press conference to say, here's X, Y, and Z, case closed, there will be other people that say my suspect was the guy, and there's got to be some kind of mistake here, but not me. If the police come out and say this case is solved and it's not Mac, it's someone else, I'll accept that and move on. I am going to say that I'm probably never going to look at another suspect again, because it's taken up too much life of my time and life looking at suspects over the years. Not so much in recent years, but I've spent countless hours and hours and hours of my life at other suspects, just helping people weed through suspects. And now I've just come to the point where if Mac is not the guy, I'm not going to dig anymore. I'll just sit back and wait until the case is solved and see what's revealed. I just don't have the energy, and I've got just too much other work and stuff going on in my life to spend the time going through this. But so that's a big rambling nutshell presentation of Mac. Again, stay tuned after this part ends, and we're going to hear from Lee Mellor to talk about his profile, and Doug MacGregor to talk about his geoprofile of where he thinks Zodiac lived and why, and I think listeners will get a lot of information out of that. So hope you enjoyed this. Again, you want to check out the full, detailed 27,000 post thread, head over to Tom Voigt's site, ZodiacKiller.com, and look for MacGruber, MacGruber, and it's pinned in the Zodiac Hot Topics section right at the beginning of the site. There's a lot there, a lot to weed through. And if there's anyone out there listening that has more information on William McDuff Andrew, born 1945, come forward, please. I'd love to hear your story. I'd love to hear what you have to say. If there's audio, video, photos, more stuff of his writing especially, I'd love to see it. So please come forward with it. There is one thing, just a little nugget that I wanted to mention, because I just thought it was very interesting. And I don't want to forget, so it's sort of out of place here. But Tom Voigt mentioned the possibility that Zodiac mailed Valentine's stickers in his Halloween card in 1970. And the reason Tom mentioned that and thought that could be the case was because one of the police officers he had some interactions with, and I forget which one it was off the top of my head, had replicas made of everything Zodiac sent because they wanted to have like some props to demonstrate what Zodiac had sent. And in the Halloween card, according to Tom, he opened them up and there were Valentine's stickers in there. Again, Mac, born February 14th, Valentine's Day. If that's the case, that's just a huge clue that nobody would really know. It wouldn't really make sense to a lot of people, but here you go, a Halloween card being mailed with Valentine's stickers in there. If that's the case, if that's accurate, just a huge thumb in the nose of police, like here's a clue, and you're not even going to know what to do with it. But looking back now with someone that has all this going for them and then born on February 14th, if those stickers are indeed true and Zodiac sent that stuff, then that makes Mac look even stronger as a suspect at this point. But again, that's something that has not been, publicly verified that that's accurate. But just a little nugget on top of a bunch of nuggets that just seem to connect dots between Mac and Zodiac. But that's it for Mac right now. And again, stay tuned for the other parts of this episode. And in the future, I'm going to have a conversation with a DNA expert who can help weed through what can be done with DNA in this case, maybe solve the case, and who also worked on the Bates case in some capacity. So I hope to have that conversation out on an episode coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. This episode's going to be so big that I have to break it up into 2 parts. So after you get done this first part, part 1, head over to part 2, which will be available at the same time, and you can listen to the conclusion of this to hear more on the profile by Dr. Lee Mellor and the Geoprofiling by Doug MacGregor. So be sure to check that out, and thank you for listening. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.